Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about photography and film documentaries. Now, in our conversation, we're actually going to be covering some of the stuff that we've already talked about in this course with respect to paintings and drawings, as well as with respect to fictional movies. Now, that being said, the way that photography and documentaries is expressed, there are some issues or sort of slants on these types of questions that are notable and worth considering as we use some of those existing strategies. So let's start off talking a little bit about photography. So photography really, when you think about analyzing it, as well as for documentaries too, we could still use a lot of the strategies that we talked about in terms of thinking about the ways in which an artist comes to create the art that they have. So between the surface product, going back to the composition and the concept school of thought that they're working within and the form strategy that they're using or the ideas that they're using, and how these come together to sort of create a meaningful piece of art. Now, very often when we think about photography, we often think about photography as being within that lower corner, where it's highly realistic. In fact, that picture down in the lowest corner is actually a picture of a photograph, right? So the idea is that with a photograph, you're taking an exact image of what you're seeing. But that doesn't always do justice to the range of ways that photography can be used. You can actually have photography become quite abstract. You can also use in a way that you're conveying a message in a more iconic way, right? So there is ways with photography still does use the spectrum of this plane, but very often it does find itself in that lower corner there. So when we're thinking about looking at photographs, there are a lot of commonalities with looking at paintings or drawings. But one of the first things you might look at is on the surface level, what is the tone and style like? What is the presentation? What are you seeing and what is being expressed? Another thing that you can think about with respect to photos is that there's actually a lot of techniques that one can use as a photographer to create what we call visual weight, or where the density of focus in the film is. So you can actually dull out or blur out a background and focus on the foreground, on a person, for example. Or you can create an even focus. You can also do things that in terms of lighting or in terms of color that attract attention in certain ways. So seeing how that photo is created to develop an attraction in the viewer is an important component to looking at a photograph and understanding it. And this really also relates to the composition. So how is it set up? How is the space set up? What are the visual elements that go into making that image work or not work? You also could look at and think about how the background is treated in an image. Is it blurred out, or is it conveying important information that helps you to understand what the photographer is trying to get at for you? Or is it perhaps a distraction? Perhaps that background actually diverges attention away from the iconic idea that's being presented in the foreground, for example. Another thing to think about with photography is, again, the idea that photography increasingly becomes an art as or it increasingly integrates with drawing and painting, for example, as we have more capacity to use computers to alter those images. So in some cases, photography becomes very, very dramatically changed from what actually came into the camera. So this is accepted. Some people don't like it and they will never alter a photograph in any way, and other people use it extensively. And this is sort of different ways of practicing the art that one can pay attention to as part of understanding what that photograph is doing. one thing that is important to think about in terms of photography is the framing. And this is talked about by scholars like Susan Sontag and other theoreticians about photography and its meaning. But it's really important to be aware that cameras tell a very specific story. They tell the story that's within the frame of what's being shown in that image, right? And that can, sometimes we think about photos as being realistic or conveying truth. But there's many ways in which, if you understood a bigger picture, or if that frame of reference had been broader or shifted in some way, it might tell a very different story. And the point here is that photos are not necessarily always as real as they seem, right? They are an opportunity to construct a reality, and there's an artistry to that, and sometimes a fictional element to conveying that reality that an artist can use, right? And sometimes this can be used well, and sometimes this can be used to create false narratives, right, about what's going on. So it's just important to think about this when you look at an image, to think of and imagine what might be outside that frame, and how might this image be composed to convey a specific message. A big issue that comes up in photography is ethical representation, and this comes up in all arts, but there are issues with photography. So there's long-standing issues, for example, with National Geographic, where photographers go around the world and represent indigenous cultures, and sometimes don't represent them very well, and in some cases exotify them and don't actually treat them in a respectful way. I was actually just looking at some climate change photography that was looking at talking about people who are refugees from climate disasters. And the name of that photography series was The Wretched of the Earth, right? So The Wretched of the Earth, it's a quote, but when you're talking about people, is that a respectful way of describing people? Do people want to be seen as the wretched of the earth, right? Who are going through these really challenging experiences. So the idea here just being, how do we actually treat people who are being taken pictures of? Are they actually willing participants? Do they even know that they're being photographed? Are they treated with respect in that? Are they being shown in a way that is dismissive of their personhood in various different ways? And is it done in a way that actually treats the seriousness of their situation or the disaster that they're handling respectfully and with the weight that it deserves? Now, there's different movements in photography that actually are countervailing forces in these types of challenges that are really significant in photography. So there's collaborative efforts to create photography in communication with individuals or with communities. And there's also interesting processes where it's actually a research process where you actually provide cameras to people in communities that you're trying to do work with, and they take photographs that sort of describe the reality of their existence. So it comes from their point of view. So the idea here is just that photographs convey a story, and it's important to understand what that story is being told, what the biases are of the photographer, and how the people who are in those images are being represented and treated. I think that there's a huge amount of climate change photography out there. I'm going to provide some examples from different photographers I've seen just to illustrate some of the scope of the different types of work that's out there. Not all inclusive. You could find much more that we don't have time for, but this is one photographer that I like, who YANN ARTHUS-BERTRAND, who does photography from above. And when we think about analysis of photos, what does photography from above do? Remember, we're talking about perspective, right? So photography from above creates these wide swaths where you create an understanding of the Earth as a larger picture. It also presents certain ways of seeing patterns that you might not see from the ground. But it can also be divorced from some of the real human experience that's there, right? So, there's pros and cons to this type of strategy, but understanding that perspective is important to this work that's being done. This is a photograph after a typhoon in Indonesia, showing, and the photographer used it as a way of illustrating the importance of having emergency preparedness and early warning systems so that people can get away. So they talked the photographer talked a lot about that in that context. This is another photograph that was done in Algiers, looking at irrigation in the desert. And it was used to talk about the ecosystem impacts of this, where there's a tremendous amount of water usage to create agriculture in this environment. And it's really dropping the water table to present potentially real significant issues for water access. And also because it's used for agriculture, a lot of that water table is being contaminated with herbicides and pesticides. So there are real challenges that are coming out, and that this is used as a way to show in a big picture the challenge that's facing these communities. This is my favorite photograph by this photographer. It's really amazing because this is actually a natural shape. It was not designed to look this way, but it's a forestry in Sweden, where they've gone in and cut down a lot of trees, but the actual location looks like a tree itself. What's interesting symbolically about this is that the trees that are being cut here are conifers, which are being planted because they grow really fast. But these conifers actually don't handle extreme weather events very well, and there was a huge impact at this time in terms of a lot of conifers being knocked down and lost to industry because of weather events. Whereas if they had actually stuck to not tried to maximize money and stuck to hardwoods, those hardwoods would have survived. And you notice the shape of the image there is actually an image of a deciduous tree, which would typically be a hardwood. So it's just like a fascinating example of photography that tells this interesting story. This is a work of Laurie Nix and Kathleen Graeber, and this is out of the collection of Artwork for Change, where there's the citation there. This is an interesting example of photographs, and really this is almost a connection between both photographs and sculpture, in the sense that they create these scenes, and they're creating essentially a post-human scene. And the images at the bottom are of different fish, and they have this, they're using color in sort of a strange way, a very highly contrasting way, having this pastel-y sort of dark image, and then the really bright image of the fish tank there, to sort of create this fairly strange image in terms of talking about the recovery of wildlife after humans leave. Edward Burtynsky has done some interesting work, and here he was really trying to do work around thinking about oil and oil's impact. Here we see this fairly desolate landscape that is just dotted with oil rigs that are pulling up oil to be used. And he connects this in with the later impacts. Both of these are shot in California, and this is in Los Angeles, where that oil is eventually being used and burned and put into the atmosphere. And in Los Angeles itself, you will also see these oil rigs, oil pumps. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Sort of talking about the process of development and use of oil. This is an interesting photograph that I think sort of illustrates the way in which photography we think of it as realistic, and this is a realistic photo, but it does sort of begin to blend in terms of style into the abstract. so that you look at it and you don't quite understand what it is. And that, of course, for many people, increases your engagement with that image. This is an image in Iceland of where the snow is melting away, and what they actually find is that there's an increase in land mass due to this. So land is actually expanding in Iceland, so there's more land to be used for other purposes. And it's also interesting because the weight of the snow is actually leading decreasing compression on the land, so the land is actually rising in many places. Sort of an interesting image illustrating this. Chris Jordan is actually a photographer that I believe lives here in Seattle, and he's fairly famous for his work doing photos of albatrosses. And this is a fledgling albatross. A lot of them are dying out because they're eating a lot of plastic, which is killing them. And this is an actual body of a dead albatross that is filled with plastic, and it's unaltered. This is what it looks like. And he took many pictures of dead albatrosses, and I think there's a book that he put together talking about this sort of disaster. There's also a podcast where he talks about the emotional impact that it had on him to do this type of work. So another interesting example. Again, here the photograph's very much framed, very specific, and sort of you see both life and death in a combination there. This is Antonio BRICEño, who is an interesting photographer who does work in Venezuela. A lot of his work is really trying to emphasize and talk about spirituality and the connection to nature that people have in these communities. And this photograph is really trying to raise awareness of the way that dams and impacts on water systems are in fact impacting wildlife and fish species and the people who rely on those fish for sustenance. And you see this imagery, again, getting back to symbolism and spirituality with the halo of fish around his head. This is Sebastian Copeland. I think that this is an image of an iceberg in Greenland. It's kind of an interesting one, I think, because this is kind of an interesting example of tone in photographs where it's kind of washed out, and you have the vignetting, which creates that old antique style look to it. There's a bit of texture in the photograph too. And I don't know that this is a case, but I wonder whether this was a distinct artistic choice to sort of talk about time and talk about the ways in which these icebergs are melting away, and sort of the idea that they might not be permanent and they might be a thing of the past. I'm not sure that was the intent, but that is sort of what I'm getting from this. This is CECILIA Paredes, who put together, this is again a piece of photography that is combining sculpture with photography, where she created this cape from collected feathers from a man who had created protected macaws and parrots, hundreds of them, and created protected preserve for them, and sort of using to illustrate that protection, using a person, and sort of a very powerful image, very colorful and powerful, and interesting composition as well. So that's talking a little bit about some of these photographs, giving some illustrations. It's kind of nice to sort of see the scope of different types of work that can be done there. I like it a lot. I think it's a very interesting form to experiment with. I'm going to move now to documentary film, and the ways in which film is used to try and tell a story about something that's going on in the world, and to engage with the audience around these ideas. When it comes to how one critique a documentary film, you can actually pretty much use the same film critique considerations that one would use for looking at a fictional film. All these elements still apply in documentaries or nonfiction films. That being said, there's some characteristics of documentary films that sort of encourage distinct emphasis on some of these components. And I'm going to go through some of these components just as a reminder, but I'm also going to talk about some elements of documentary film that I just think are worth considering. So something that's really important with documentaries is to remember that very often they are conveyed in a smooth way to create a powerful impact so that they have this appearance of objective truth. And it's very easy to get sucked into the documentary and just take for granted everything that's being told and the story that's being composed. It's really important for documentaries to also take a step back and really question what are the motivations of the director, how are stories and facts combined to create a story to make you believe certain things. Documentaries still use form, and the appearance and style of this is going to reinforce the story that's being told. And it's important to take a critical look at how it was designed to achieve a certain goal. In films, in these documentaries, thinking about interviews and how they're used is also quite important. Now, when we talked earlier about representation and how people are represented, this is also really important for film. There are films out there, documentary films. For example, there's a movie called Cane Toads, which looks at species that were imported into Australia, cane toads, that essentially took over and caused major ecological disaster. And it's actually a really funny film in some ways, but the way that it becomes funny is by interviewing people and essentially mocking them about their experience with these cane toads, right? So there's still these ideas about respect of interviewers and the ways in which people are translated, the ways in which they're positioned in films, and the ways that they're given voice to speak about their experience is important. And also paying attention to, sometimes you can't tell this, but paying attention to how what they're said is cut to achieve the ends of the director is also important as well. You can also think about narration. So how is narration used to connect all these ideas? Sometimes it's used, sometimes it's not used. But the smoothness and the way that it's used to tell a story and provide a perspective and provide this overall analysis is an important element to understanding documentaries. People have different opinions about this. Some documentary filmmakers will not provide any narration or voiceover and just leave it up to the viewer to form their own opinion based upon the assembled clips or information that's provided. When we're looking at this, again, we want to step back and think about what the key messages were and whether it was actually communicated effectively or not. Did the message come together about this film, or was it disconnected? You also want to analyze what the filmmakers were trying to get from the audience. Were they trying to produce some sort of emotional response, or some sort of intellectual response, or some type of action, for example? And as you look at the trajectory in that sort of element of things, you would think about, did the documentary actually encourage people to critically think about this question, this challenge that's being addressed? Or did it push people towards using emotional reasoning or using their own personal political biases to just make assumptions about people or about the topic area? So thinking about those balance of how things were done in this film are important. Now, as we go through the different components that we've already talked about in terms of filmmaking, for documentaries, content is really important. Thinking about what information is providing, what's missing, and how accurate that information is going to be really important for analyzing a documentary film, right? Because a lot of what a documentary film typically are doing is trying to convey information. So a big test of it is what information is there and how much do you trust it. Perspective and narration also really connects in there. That perspective of why this film was made, what perspectives are being provided and whose perspectives are being left out, and how much you trust that voice is going to be really important. And as we do this, we would look again at what we see the agenda or potential biases are. And these can be explicit biases, which are direct and known about the thing that's being created. And that could be social politics or scientific debates or other things like that. But you also want to pay attention to these implicit or unconscious biases around how people might be treated in a stereotypical way, for example. All right. Representation in documentaries is also really crucial. We've already talked about that a little bit, but it becomes really important in terms of making sure that people have a voice in the film, and that people with different experience are given a level of expertise in conveying that experience in terms of the range of populations and the vulnerable populations that might need to be represented here. And then also, because part of the idea of this documentaries very often is to make an impact fairly directly, thinking about what the implications of films are. And The Inconvenient Truth is one example of this. This is a very central documentary. I haven't assigned this documentary, but it really, in many ways, launched a lot of conversations around climate change. But it also did influence the political polarization around this. When you have a political figure like Al Gore, who's associated with Democrats and who becomes a very prominent figure in terms of talking about climate change, that creates an easy situation to create opposition and reactance against this and to create a partisan situation. So there's interesting conversations around these types of things, and thinking about what a film does, how it galvanizes a response, and what types of changes it's seeking to encourage is going to be important for these documentaries. Now, I'm not going to go through all the different elements that one could analyze, but obviously form elements are really important. Other elements are really interesting. But I just want to refresh our memory about these because they really tie in particularly tightly to documentary analysis. So here's again all the different ones that one could think about in terms of analysis. As you move forward with doing your analyses, I hope that you can take some of these considerations into consideration. I think when we have photographs and documentaries, it's particularly easy to see them as being fact, and having these critical tools to pull them apart and question them and ask what's going on behind the scenes can be quite helpful. So again, thank you for listening. I hope this was interesting. So take care and be well.